So, the HOA president physically kicks in the door of my cabin at the exact moment I'm sharing a beer with the state's attorney general. She proceeds to commit 6 felonies in the presence of the single individual in the nation who could personally ensure she went to prison. I'm referring to a complete scene of splintering wood, the click of designer heels on fractured glass. The whole dramatic affair, this woman, clad in a $1,000 blazer and emanating an aggressive perfume that probably costs more than my truck payment, invades my grandfather's cabin, shouting about violations and jurisdiction as if she holds the deed. She has absolutely no idea who she just interrupted. She has no idea she is live-streaming the creation of her own arrest warrant to 3,000 followers. Half a year prior, I believed Karen was simply your average neighbor intoxicated by a little power. It turned out she was orchestrating a $4 million embezzlement operation, and I was about to inadvertently bring her whole criminal empire crashing down. What would you do if an HOA psychopath trespassed on your private property in the middle of your life's most critical meeting? Leave a comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from. I can assure you that half of you have had to contend with these neighborhood tyrants before. Let me rewind and explain how this whole chaotic situation began. 6 months ago, life was quite enjoyable. My name is Marcus Henley. I'm 52 years old, and after 3 decades spent crawling through muddy trenches to install power grids across 3 counties, I had finally secured my retirement. The prized possession was my grandfather's fishing cabin on Clearwater Lake, a 2-acre piece of paradise that old Pop purchased in 1963 for a mere $800. Can you fathom that? $800 for a lakefront property that is now valued higher than most people's homes. This wasn't some opulent McMansion. To be clear, we're talking about hand-hewn logs, a stone fireplace that Pop constructed with his own calloused hands, and a screened-in porch that groaned in all the most comforting ways. I had deliberately kept it entirely off-grid, with solar panels humming softly on the roof, well water that tasted of childhood, and a septic system that honestly worked more efficiently than many urban setups. The morning vapor rising from the lake each day served as a reminder of why Pop selected this location. He often said, "The land chooses you, you don't choose it." A wise man, he also used to say, "Marcus, when somebody desperately wants your land, discover their reason, because it's typically worth much more than they're admitting." Then she arrived. Delilah Cromwell, though universally known as that HOA psycho, descended upon our quiet lake community like a tempest in designer apparel. At 58 years old, she was a recent transplant from some California subdivision where, it seemed, playing neighborhood dictator was a full-time occupation. She drove a pearl-white Escalade with vanity plates that proclaimed Rule 1. I'm not joking, and she wore her HOA president badge on her blazer as if it were a lawman's star. This woman had a singular mission in life: to convert our rustic lakeside haven into what she termed an upscale resort community. But here is what I was unaware of at the time. 3 elderly couples had already sold their cabins to eager buyers within 2 months of her arrival. A strange coincidence, don't you think? Her initial hostile act occurred on a Tuesday morning. I'm on Pop's porch, sipping coffee and observing a pair of loons schooling their young in diving, when I hear the sharp, clicking sound of designer heels on my wooden dock. At 7 a.m., on my private land, 10 minutes later, she's affixing an official-looking document to my screen door. It was a violation citation for an unsightly dock structure damaging community property values. The fine was $500, with compliance demanded within 72 hours, or daily penalties would be applied. I had to read it a second time. My weathered dock, the very one Pop and I had strengthened together when I was 12, was supposedly an eyesore that was jeopardizing the entire neighborhood's property market. As a reasonable person, I walked over to her to clarify that my property, in fact, predated the HOA by roughly 40 years. Do you know what she said to me, standing there in my own driveway with her hands on her hips as if she owned it? "Everyone on this lake reports to me, sweetie. Ask the Hendersons how effectively fighting me worked out for them." The Hendersons were my elderly neighbors, who had inexplicably opted to downsize the previous month after residing here for 23 years. The connections weren't forming yet, but a cold feeling settled in my gut. That's when she began her photo shoot, circling my cabin like she was a real estate appraiser, taking pictures of my solar panels, my vegetable patch, and even my grandfather's hand-carved porch railings. The scent of her chemical air freshener drifting from that idling Escalade made me feel nauseous. By the week's end, I had received 3 more citations. Each was accompanied by increasing fines and made it abundantly clear that Delilah Cromwell had waged war on everything my family had established on this land. I assumed I was contending with a typical power-hungry neighbor, irritating, certainly, but manageable. What I didn't realize was that I had just become a target in a game far larger and more perilous than trivial HOA disputes. Pop's words echoed in my mind. Find out why they want your land. I was on the verge of discovering why, and it was going to alter everything. Karen didn't hesitate to bring in the heavy hitters 3 days after my compliance deadline had passed. Because, frankly, I wasn't demolishing Pop's dock for some wannabe tyrant. A certified letter showed up that made my coffee taste like cinders. It was a cease and desist order citing a violation of community waterway regulations. The letterhead was from Blackstone, Meyer & Associates, one of those high-priced law firms whose partners likely billed more per hour than I earned in a month. The legal jargon essentially stated that my dock was illegally encroaching on a community waterway and that I owed $3,000 in retroactive violation fees. Furthermore, they were threatening to place a lien on my property if I failed to pay within 10 days. My initial reaction was to panic. These individuals had lawyers. I had a set of tools and a defiant attitude, but then I recalled something Pop had consistently drilled into me during those long afternoons of fishing. Marcus, when someone tries to use legal language to take your land, the actual truth is always in the county records. Never believe what they say. Go find the real documents. So, I headed down to the county courthouse, to that musty basement where all the vital records are buried under layers of bureaucratic dust. The clerk, a kind woman named Betty who remembered Pop from his fishing tournament days, assisted me in retrieving the original property surveys. I had picked up the strategy from my union days. Always review the source materials before some person in a suit tries to intimidate you with fancy stationery. What I discovered made my blood boil. My grandfather's parcel didn't just extend to the water's edge. It encompassed 50 feet into the lake itself. The deed, officially stamped in 1963, was perfectly clear. That dock wasn't encroaching on community property. It was located squarely in the middle of my lakefront, but here is the truly significant detail. The HOA was not founded until 1998, a full 35 years after Pop had acquired his land. I remembered my old foreman often saying that older properties frequently possess rights that newer developments cannot override. Something about grandfathered exemptions that supersede any neighborhood association rules. Equipped with copies of all the documents, I returned to my cabin feeling quite pleased with myself. That feeling of accomplishment lasted precisely until I attempted to drive out for groceries and discovered Karen's Escalade parked horizontally across my driveway. Not alongside it, not close to it, but directly obstructing it as if she were staging a one-woman blockade. When I rapped on her window, she lowered it just enough to talk through the opening. "Oh, Marcus, I'm simply reviewing the community parking regulations. This could take some time." The mechanical drone of her idling engine combined with that cloyingly sweet air freshener formed a surreal bubble of passive-aggressive madness. Here I was, a grown man who had constructed half the county's power infrastructure, being held captive in my own driveway by a suburban mom with a control issue. But Karen was only just beginning. Within a week, she had formed something she called the Lakeside Beautification Committee, which sounds pleasant until you grasp that it was essentially an enforcement squad aimed at anyone who didn't conform to her country club ideal. Suddenly, neighbors who had greeted me with a wave for years were now crossing the street to evade making eye contact. Her Facebook posts were works of art in passive-aggressive conflict, concerned about eyesore properties impacting all our home values. And some people just don't care about the community #Lakeside Strong #property values. The comments section devolved into a feeding frenzy. Individuals I'd known for decades were suddenly authorities on property law, echoing Karen's talking points as if she were some kind of real estate oracle. 3 of my neighbors actually offered me private apologies. Tom and Susan Martinez took me aside during my evening stroll and admitted that Karen had strongly implied they should complain about my property or risk facing their own barrage of citations. Apparently, she had already gone after old Mr. Peterson for having non-compliant window boxes and had threatened the young couple with a baby over their unsightly playground set. "She has something on everyone," Tom whispered, looking around as if Karen might be concealed in the shrubbery with a camera. "Her husband works at the state capitol. Connected, political stuff." That information struck me like a cold splash of water. This was no longer just a neighborhood spat. This woman had influence that extended beyond our small lake community. That evening, I discovered orange spray paint all over my mailbox, with bold, aggressive letters spelling out, Comply or leave. My security camera, solar-powered and concealed behind a pine tree, captured the entire event, including Karen's license plate as she departed at 2:30 a.m. When I contacted the sheriff's office the next morning, guess who responded? Deputy Chad Cromwell, Karen's nephew. He glanced at the vandalism report, shrugged, and remarked, "Probably just kids, you know how they are." The rough feel of that spray paint beneath my fingers as I attempted to scrub it away felt like sandpaper on my spirit. Pop often said, "Sometimes a bigger fight requires bigger guns. It's time to get some bigger guns." Karen's subsequent action was masked as civic responsibility, which somehow made it all the more infuriating. She had realized that direct confrontation wasn't effective, so she opted to turn the entire county's administrative system against me. It began with a courteous knock on my door from Building Inspector Dale Morrison, a man I had actually collaborated with on several projects over the years. The uncomfortable expression on his face conveyed everything I needed to know before he even spoke. "Marcus, I'm truly sorry about this, but I received a complaint regarding unpermitted structures on your property. You know I have to investigate these things." 3 hours later, Dale had meticulously examined every part of my cabin with his clipboard and tape measure. His finding was that everything was not only compliant with the code, but in fact surpassed current safety requirements. Pop may have been from the old school, but he built things to endure. "Whoever lodged this complaint," Dale mumbled as he put away his equipment, "either has no idea what they're talking about or is simply trying to waste everyone's time." The following day brought Environmental Officer Janet Bennett to investigate allegations that my septic system was polluting the lake's ecosystem. Once again, it was in perfect working order, better than most new systems, she conceded. Then, Fire Marshal Bob Rodriguez arrived to inspect my solar panels for potential electrical hazards. I received a clean bill of health there as well. Each inspection cost me a day of tranquility and a piece of my retirement peace of mind. But more significantly, each baseless report was generating an official record that portrayed me as some kind of problematic property owner. I recalled something my union representative used to caution us about. Bureaucratic harassment was a common strategy because it appeared legitimate on paper, even when it was purely malicious. While I was managing the parade of inspections, Karen was skillfully playing her media game. She had successfully arranged an interview for herself on Channel 7's Community Spotlight segment, casting herself as a concerned citizen striving to safeguard our family-friendly lake environment. The news report was a masterclass in biased editing. She displayed carefully framed photographs that made my cabin appear like some backwoods dwelling, spoke of dangerous conditions that threatened the safety of children, and portrayed herself as a courageous advocate challenging irresponsible property owners. What truly made my blood boil was seeing her stand on my dock, the very one she asserted was illegally trespassing, while she delivered her concerned citizen act for the cameras. The sharp buzz of my phone with irate texts from neighbors who had watched the story felt like a volley of machine gun fire. Half of the lake community now believed I was some sort of environmental threat. But this is where Karen made her first significant error. She became overconfident. My old friend Jake Martinez from the Electricians Union called me after watching the news report. "Marcus, that woman is full of it, and everyone knows it. You constructed half the clean energy infrastructure in this county. Hell, your solar setup is the one I use as a model when I'm training new apprentices." Within 2 days, Jake had arranged for a procession of my former colleagues to drive by and examine my property. It turns out that having 20 master electricians publicly attest to your work has a way of quickly quashing the hazardous installation story. That's when events began to take an interesting turn. My lawyer friend, Chuck Davis, with whom I had attended high school, came by for a beer and said something that caught my attention. "You know, Marcus, the Attorney General's office has been looking into cases of HOA corruption across the state. Several communities have reported harassment patterns similar to what you're describing." "What sort of patterns?" I inquired, although I was fairly certain I already knew the answer. Elderly homeowners being targeted with baseless citations, property values being artificially suppressed, and mysterious buyers appearing with cash offers. Sound familiar? It sounded exactly familiar. Chuck clarified that these schemes typically involved someone with political ties providing protection while the harassment campaign forced out long-term residents. The properties would then be resold to developers for huge profits. "The AG's office is seeking witnesses," Chuck went on. "People who have documented the harassment and can demonstrate the pattern. Someone like you might be just what they need." The mechanical hum of my refrigerator seemed unusually Loud as that information registered, Karen wasn't just a power-crazed neighbor. She was possibly involved in something much larger and more methodical. That night, I began keeping a meticulous record of every interaction, every citation, and every inspection that had suddenly materialized on my schedule. I also started to investigate Karen's background more thoroughly. It turned out her husband, Robert Cromwell, wasn't just a minor state official, he was the Democratic Party treasurer, a role that granted him access to development proposals, zoning amendments, and political favors throughout multiple counties. The scent of fresh coffee mingling with the morning lake air usually had a calming effect on me, but now it only served as a reminder of how much I stood to lose. This was no longer about HOA fees. This was about whether I would become the next casualty in someone else's scheme to get rich quick. Karen's subsequent phase made everything that had preceded it seem like a minor squabble. She had evidently concluded that bureaucratic harassment was not progressing quickly enough, so she pivoted to a full-scale assault on my character. It began with a Facebook post that made my stomach churn. Urgent safety concerns about aggressive behavior from lakefront resident. Please keep your children away from the Eastern Shore area. We'll be filing for protective measures. Hashtag Lakeside Safety. Hashtag ProtectTourKids. Aggressive behavior? Me, the man who had helped run the annual Kids Fishing Derby for 15 years straight. Within a matter of hours, that post had been shared 43 times. The comments section transformed into a digital mob of individuals who had never even met me, all persuaded that I was some kind of dangerous eccentric based on Karen's meticulously constructed victim story. I always felt something was not right about that man. Heard he threatened an HOA board member? Thank God we have courageous people like Delilah looking out for us. The truly disturbing aspect was that half of these comments originated from profiles with generic stock images, the type of fraudulent accounts that political strategists employ to boost their messaging. Karen wasn't merely disseminating falsehoods, she was directing a professional smear operation. 2 days later, she petitioned for a restraining order. The document, which became a matter of public record, depicted me as an unstable person who made verbal threats against community figures. It was a complete lie, but that was irrelevant. The filing itself became evidence that I was dangerous. Judge Patricia Harris, who had known my family for years, reviewed Karen's evidence and threw out the request due to a lack of credible proof. But the harm was already done. There was now an official court document bearing my name, alongside the word threats. The emotional strain was starting to affect me. I would sit on Pop's porch in the evenings, sipping a beer and wondering if this battle was worth sacrificing the tranquil retirement I had dedicated 30 years to achieving. The feel of his leather recliner was different now, less a source of comfort and more a weight of responsibility to uphold a legacy that someone was methodically attempting to dismantle. But just as I was on the verge of giving up, something remarkable occurred. The community began to push back. Judge Harris wasn't the only one who remembered my family. Retired Judge William Bill Carter, who used to go fishing with Pop in the 70s, appeared at my door with a thermos of coffee and some unsolicited legal counsel. Marcus, that woman is playing a game your grandfather would have seen through immediately. She's relying on you to feel isolated and defeated. Don't grant her that pleasure. Bill clarified that organized harassment campaigns like this often pointed to broader criminal conduct. People don't go to these lengths over minor neighborhood disagreements. There's money at stake here, a lot of money. The local VFW Post, where I had been a member for 2 decades, released a statement describing Karen's allegations as baseless attacks on a decorated community member. The Historical Society joined in, emphasizing my cabin's cultural importance as one of the last original buildings on the lake. Even the environmental organization that monitored the lake's water quality commended my sustainable living approach. It felt as though the entire decent segment of our community was uniting behind me. The acrid taste of stress was at last being replaced by something that resembled hope. But Karen was not finished, not by a long shot. Her next action was devilishly simple. She somehow persuaded the utility company to look into irregularities in my electrical service. For 3 days, I was without power while they examined my solar grid connection for safety infractions. Then came the fraudulent police reports. Suspicious activity at my cabin in the middle of the day. Loud noises, suggesting a possible domestic dispute when I was obviously by myself, and possible drug activity based on the unusual number of visitors, who happened to be union colleagues stopping by to offer support. Each call brought sheriff's deputies to my door. Each visit resulted in another incident report. Each report contributed to the expanding file that made me appear to be a troublesome resident. The most infuriating aspect was that Deputy Chad Cromwell was often the officer who responded. He would arrive, ask a few cursory questions, and depart with a smirk that conveyed he knew precisely what his aunt was up to. During one particularly bizarre visit, he actually had the audacity to say, "You know, Mr. Henley, if you just apologized to my aunt and brought your property up to code, all these issues would probably disappear." That's when it dawned on me that this was no longer just about me. Karen was demonstrating to other property owners what occurred when you refused to submit. The Hendersons, the elderly couple who had strangely decided to sell, likely endured this very same ordeal. The electronic chime of my phone became a trigger for anxiety rather than a means of connection. Every notification could be another neighbor siding against me, another fabricated report, another move in Karen's psychological warfare, but it also delivered messages of encouragement from people I had forgotten even knew me. The struggle was far from over, but I was finally beginning to understand the rules of engagement. The major advance occurred while I was engaged in the most mundane task imaginable. Sorting through documents for my meeting with the Attorney General's office, Chuck had set up the entire meeting, explaining that they required thorough documentation for their statewide investigation into HOA corruption. I was seated at Pop's old oak table, engulfed by piles of citations, inspection summaries, and legal notices, when something caught my attention. One of Karen's violation letters had a small footer I had previously overlooked: fines payable to Lakeside Estates' Community Improvement Fund, account number 847291. Community Improvement Fund? It sounded legitimate enough, but something about it bothered me. Perhaps it was 3 decades of scrutinizing electrical contracts and identifying the fine print that contractors used to take advantage of homeowners. In any case, I chose to investigate further. The county clerk's office had practically become my second home by then. So Betty knew precisely what I needed when I inquired about HOA financial records. She retrieved the public filings and laid them out on the counter as if she were dealing a hand of cards. "Here's the situation, Marcus," she remarked, pushing her reading glasses up. "Homeowner associations are obligated to file annual reports just like any other entity. Let me show you what I discovered." The figures were completely off. Over the preceding 2 years, the HOA had gathered $280,000 in emergency assessments for lake dock repairs that had never been carried out. An additional $150,000 had allegedly been spent on professional landscaping services from Cromwell Grounds and Maintenance, a company that, according to state business records, was owned by Karen's brother-in-law. But here is the critical detail. The landscaping company had been established exactly 3 weeks after Karen assumed the role of HOA president. I recalled Pop's guidance about tracing the money. When someone establishes a business immediately after gaining power, they are typically setting it up to divert funds to themselves. The insurance claims were even more egregious. The HOA had submitted claims for storm damage reimbursement on 3 separate occasions in the past 18 months. The issue was, I had experienced every storm on this lake, and none of them had inflicted the kind of damage that would warrant $95,000 in insurance payments. Betty assisted me in comparing the insurance claims with actual weather data from the National Weather Service. The dates did not align. The HOA was claiming storm damage on days when the weather had been perfectly fine. "Marcus," Betty whispered, even though we were the only ones in the records room, "this appears to be fraud, simple, straightforward fraud." My hands were genuinely trembling as I made copies of everything. The slick feel of those documents seemed like I was holding evidence that could alter the entire situation. This was no longer just about harassment. It was systematic theft from the entire lake community. The property management fees were the last element of the puzzle. The HOA was paying $5,000 a month to an entity called Clearwater Property Solutions for administrative work. However, when I searched the business registration, the address provided was a P.O. box in the same postal area where Karen resided. Everything fell into place like the tumblers of a lock. Karen's campaign of harassment wasn't merely about control or a personal grudge. She was methodically devaluing properties to facilitate a development project while simultaneously embezzling from the community's funds. The elderly couples who had sold their cabins hadn't just been pestered into leaving. They had been compelled to sell at prices below market value because Karen's manufactured concerns about property values had deterred legitimate buyers. Those enigmatic cash buyers were likely associated with the same development company that was profiting from the embezzled money. I thought of the Hendersons, likely struggling financially in some small apartment, oblivious to the fact that they had been cheated twice. Once when they sold their dream home for a fraction of its worth, and again through the fees they had contributed to Karen's personal fund. The taste of black coffee had never been so acrid. This wasn't solely about my cabin anymore. Karen had been stealing from everyone, including the neighbors she had. Persuaded to turn against me, Pop always said that when you uncover corruption, it's typically more extensive than you realize. He was correct. Karen wasn't just managing an HOA. She was operating a criminal enterprise, and I was about to deliver the evidence to the one person in the state with the power to shut it down for good. That evening, I converted Pop's spare bedroom into what resembled a police command center. Maps of the lake property were spread across the walls, contrasting original property lines with current HOA assertions. Timeline charts detailed Karen's harassment campaign alongside suspicious financial activities. Photos, recordings, and documents were all sorted by potential criminal offenses. I felt like a detective from a TV show, only instead of pursuing serial killers, I was tracking down suburban embezzlers. The Attorney General's office had put 2 prosecutors on my case, Sarah Mitchell and David Bennett, who showed up the next morning with an air of serious purpose. Sarah was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who brought to mind the safety inspectors that used to ensure we were honest on construction sites. David was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, but possessed a quiet focus that indicated he had already put plenty of white-collar criminals behind bars. Mr. Henley, Sarah stated, arranging the financial documents on Pop's dining table. What you've brought to light here extends far beyond simple HOA harassment. This is a systematic fraud that could affect dozens of families. David took out a tablet and began to connect details I hadn't even noticed. We've been investigating similar operations in 4 other counties. The method is always the same. Politically connected individuals exploit HOA positions to manipulate property values while siphoning off community funds. That's when they informed me about the FBI's involvement. Agent Rebecca Torres from the White Collar Crime Unit had been tracking development fraud throughout the region. It seemed my documentation was the crucial piece of evidence that could link together several ongoing investigations. The great thing about financial crimes, Agent Torres explained during our video conference, is that everything leaves a paper trail. Your HOA records display classic signs of money laundering, fabricated invoices, shell corporations, and insurance fraud. But we need more than just paperwork. We need witnesses and recorded proof of ongoing criminal acts. Chuck, my lawyer friend, had also been active behind the scenes. He had made contact with 17 other lakefront families who had faced similar harassment. When we brought them together at the VFW hall, their accounts painted a picture that made my blood boil. The Thompsons had paid $8,000 in fraudulent violation fines before selling their cabin for 30% under market value. The Garcias had been charged with emergency assessments amounting to $12,000 for lake improvements that never happened. Old Mrs. Patterson had been so frightened by Karen's legal threats that she had moved to Florida to live with her daughter, leaving behind the home she had occupied for 43 years. Every story followed the identical script. Increasing harassment, fabricated violations, pressure to sell, and every family had paid into that community improvement fund, which was, in reality, just Karen's personal slush fund. Here's what most people don't get about HOA fraud, explained retired accountant Frank Weber, who had offered to help examine the financial records. Homeowner associations are obligated to file Form 1120 tax returns each year if they meet certain income criteria. Lawful organizations file consistently. Corrupt ones typically do not because transparent accounting would reveal their theft. Frank had found that our HOA hadn't submitted proper tax returns in over 2 years, despite collecting hundreds of thousands in fees and assessments. That one fact alone could lead to federal tax evasion charges in addition to everything else. The technical strategy meeting felt like organizing a military campaign. We possessed financial proof, witness statements, recorded harassment, and documented fraud. But Agent Torres wanted something more substantial. She wanted to catch Karen in the act of committing crimes. The best way to construct a solid case, she clarified, is to create a scenario where the suspect's criminal actions are captured by law enforcement in real time. We need her to incriminate herself on video. That's when Chuck proposed the ideal plan. The Attorney General has been seeking a chance to announce new HOA reform legislation. What if she made that announcement at Marcus' cabin? It's symbolically perfect, defending homeowner rights at the very place where those rights were being violated. Sarah's eyes brightened. And if Karen's behavior stays consistent, she will definitely try to interfere with any unusual activity at Marcus' property. Her urge to control the situation will overpower her judgment. We spent the following week getting ready for what Agent Torres termed a controlled confrontation scenario. Professional recording devices were concealed throughout my cabin. Undercover agents were stationed around the lake. Multiple law enforcement agencies were coordinated for a swift response. The community coalition had expanded as well. Local media were notified of potential breaking news. Social media strategies were prepared to debunk any false stories Karen might attempt to spread. Support systems were in place for the period following the confrontation. My old union training was invaluable. When you plan a complex project, you prepare for every eventuality and always have redundant systems. We had contingency plans for our contingency plans. The trap was laid. Karen's behavioral patterns were so consistent that we could almost write the script for her next move. All we needed to do was wait for her to break down the door. Literally, Karen must have felt the pressure mounting, because her actions shifted from methodical harassment to outright sabotage. It was like observing a trapped animal striking out wildly, becoming more dangerous as its escape routes vanished. The initial indication was my solar panels mysteriously failing on a Tuesday morning. I would wake up to depleted batteries and error messages flashing on the inverter. When my electrician friend Jake came to check, he discovered clear signs of tampering. Wire connections had been loosened just enough to disrupt the flow without leaving obvious marks. "Marcus, this is professional-grade sabotage," Jake remarked, documenting the evidence with his phone. "Whoever did this understands electrical systems. They aim to create issues without leaving clear evidence." But Jake was shrewder than Karen anticipated. He had set up a concealed security camera near the electrical panel after the first event. 2 nights later, we caught her in the act, sneaking around my property at 3:00 a.m. with a screwdriver and wire cutters. The video was perfectly clear. Karen Cromwell, HOA president and respected community member, vandalizing private property in the dead of night. The sharp smell of her cigarette smoke hung in the morning air, mingling with the pine scent that usually brought me peace. Next, my boat dock was targeted. I had gone to town for supplies and came back to find my boat adrift in the middle of the lake. The heavy-duty chains I used to secure it had been severed with bolt cutters, leaving clean, precise cuts and metal filings scattered on the dock. That boat was Pop's pride and joy, a 1978 base boat that still performed flawlessly. Discovering it bumping against the far shore, its hull scraped by rocks, felt like a desecration of his memory. But Karen's most significant blunder was tampering with my septic system. I had just passed a county inspection with no issues, but suddenly my perfectly good system began to fail. The odor was unbearable. That mix of sewage and chemical agents that makes your eyes water from 50 feet away. When the emergency septic crew arrived, they found that industrial-strength drain cleaner had been poured into my system, destroying all the beneficial bacteria and causing a toxic problem. "This is intentional sabotage," the technician stated, showing me soil samples that revealed chemical contamination. "Someone introduced commercial-grade acids into your system. This material is expensive and requires expert knowledge to handle." The repair cost was $3,200, but more importantly, the chemical analysis provided forensic proof that this was not random vandalism. It was calculated destruction that demanded specialized knowledge of septic systems. While I was managing the sewage crisis, Karen was launching her media assault. Anonymous profiles flooded social media with posts about my ongoing property infractions and the deteriorating conditions that were endangering neighborhood safety. The automated bots were so blatant it was almost laughable. Dozens of accounts with generic names posting identical grievances within minutes of one another. She had also intensified her intimidation efforts. Deputy Chad Cromwell's patrol presence increased significantly. He would drive by my cabin 4 or 5 times a day, always slowing down just enough to make his surveillance apparent. Sometimes he would park in my driveway for 20 minutes, checking the license plates of any visitors. The building inspector suddenly discovered code violations in work that had been approved just weeks earlier. The fire marshal got anonymous tips about non-existent fire hazards. Environmental Services received reports of illegal dumping on parts of my property they had already inspected and cleared. It was a strategy of death by 1,000 cuts, intended to deplete my resources and crush my morale through bureaucratic attacks. But I was no longer the sole target. Karen had started to go after my allies as well. Jake's electrical contracting license was abruptly put under review for safety infractions. Bill Carter, the retired judge who had been giving me advice, received a formal complaint with the State Bar Association regarding improper legal counsel to non-clients. The VFW Post suddenly faced a surprise fire safety inspection that could have shut down their weekly bingo games. The Historical Society was hit with zoning complaints about their downtown office. Karen was methodically targeting anyone who had supported me, delivering a clear message. Assist Marcus Henley, and you will be next. The psychological strain was immense. Each morning brought new problems, new emergencies, and new bureaucratic hurdles to overcome. The metallic tang of constant stress became as routine as my morning coffee. But Karen's desperation was also opening up opportunities. Every escalation was being meticulously recorded. By law enforcement, each act of sabotage furnished more criminal evidence. Her network of supporters began to back away as her behavior grew increasingly erratic. The Attorney General's office was observing everything, constructing an ironclad case while Karen dug her own grave deeper with each spiteful action. Agent Torres referred to it as classic criminal escalation. When perpetrators feel trapped, they often make increasingly reckless choices that give prosecutors the evidence they need for a conviction. Karen was marching directly into our trap, one sabotage solar panel at a time. Karen's final move was so audacious it nearly succeeded. She had learned through her husband's political network that I wasn't simply meeting with any state official. I was meeting with Attorney General Patricia Williamson herself. Instead of retreating, Karen chose to escalate dramatically. Her strategy was brilliant in its perversity. She would cast herself as the victim of a political plot, alleging that the state's highest prosecutor was targeting her family for partisan motives. If she could capture herself confronting government corruption at my cabin, she could completely reverse the narrative and portray herself as a courageous whistleblower challenging an abuse of authority. The initial hint of her new tactic appeared on social media. She had contacted Government Accountability Watch, a network of bloggers known for amplifying stories of bureaucratic misconduct. Her proposal was flawless, a small-town HOA president being harassed by a powerful government because her husband was affiliated with the opposing political party. Local family under attack. State officials use harassment investigation to silence political opposition was the headline that began to spread 3 days before my scheduled meeting. The article depicted me as some sort of deep state operative collaborating with corrupt prosecutors to ruin an innocent family. The comments section was swamped with indignation from people who had never heard of our lake community but were utterly convinced that Karen was being unfairly targeted by partisan officials. She had tapped into the current of anti-government feeling that flows through rural areas, transforming herself into a martyr for political persecution. But Karen's masterstroke was the live stream plan. She had organized a live broadcast of her confrontation with the Attorney General on social media, presenting it as citizen journalism exposing government wrongdoing in real time. Her intention was to storm into my cabin during the meeting, record the entire event, and let her followers share the footage as evidence of official misconduct. What she was unaware of was that we were tracking her communications. Agent Torres had secured warrants for Karen's phone and social media accounts weeks before. We knew about the blogger contacts, the live stream strategy, and even the talking points she had drafted for her spontaneous confrontation. It's actually perfect, Agent Torres noted during our final planning session. She is going to commit several felonies on live video while giving us a real-time confession of her intentions. We couldn't have planned it better. The irony was delectable. Karen believed she was laying a trap for us, but she was, in fact, walking into the most comprehensively documented arrest in the history of HOAs. Her support system was also collapsing, but she was too preoccupied to realize it. The other HOA board members had quietly created distance once the financial discrepancies became apparent. Her husband was now facing his own ethics inquiry and could no longer offer political protection. Even Deputy Chad had been moved to different patrol zones after Internal Affairs began to investigate his handling of vandalism reports. But Karen was past the point of rational thought, the psychological strain of concealing her fraudulent scheme while fending off multiple investigations had pushed her to the brink. She was displaying all the typical signs of someone losing control. Paranoia about neighbors watching her, making increasingly hostile phone calls to anyone who had helped me, and convinced that everyone was involved in a massive conspiracy against her. The evening before the Attorney General's visit, she made threatening calls to 4 different families, warning them of consequences if they persisted in cooperating with the government harassment. Each call was recorded by law enforcement. Each one furnished additional proof of witness intimidation and criminal conspiracy. I spent that last evening on Pop's porch, watching the sunset cast shades of gold and crimson across the lake. The sound of loons calling to one another over the water reminded me why this place was worth defending. The next day would decide whether I could enjoy quiet evenings like this for the remainder of my retirement or if I would spend my final years contesting Karen's appeals from federal prison. The cabin had a different feel that night, not just because of the concealed cameras and recording devices, but because it had become the focal point of something much larger than my own property dispute. This was about whether small-time criminals with political ties could terrorize whole communities with impunity. I took out Pop's well-worn leather Bible and read the passage he had marked about David and Goliath in the margin. He had written, "Sometimes the underdog wins because he's fighting for something greater than himself." The morning would bring Karen's last desperate move. She would burst through that door believing she was about to vanquish her foes, never suspecting she was about to vanquish herself. The scene was set. The cameras were active. Law enforcement was ready. All we had to do was wait for Karen to deliver the grand finale to her own criminal saga. The taste of anticipation mixed with morning coffee had never been so satisfying. Attorney General Patricia Williamson was not at all what I had anticipated. Rather than an intimidating political powerhouse, she was a down-to-earth woman in her 50s who reminded me of my old high school principal. Stern but just, with eyes that saw everything, she showed up at my cabin precisely at 9:00 a.m., holding a thermos of coffee and a briefcase filled with evidence that would alter the course of events. "Mr. Henley," she began, making herself at home in Pop's old recliner as if she had been there before. "Your documentation has enabled us to build cases against HOA corruption networks in 6 different counties. What you've exposed here is not just a local issue. It's part of a statewide pattern of organized crime." We were in the middle of discussing the criminal charges when we heard it. The unmistakable sound of Karen's Escalade speeding into my driveway. Gravel flew everywhere, as if she were in some kind of high-stakes pursuit. Car doors slammed, and multiple voices shouted directions about camera positions and sound levels. Karen had arrived with her entire social media team for what she believed would be her crowning achievement. "This is it?" Agent Torres murmured into her earpiece from her concealed location behind my woodshed. Attorney General Williamson showed no reaction. She simply went on taking notes about the financial evidence as Karen's voice grew louder, hyping herself into a state of righteous indignation for her live audience. "This is the moment, everyone," Karen's voice projected clearly through my windows. "We are about to uncover the corruption that has been targeting our family. The state's attorney general is having an illegal meeting with our harasser, likely plotting more government oppression." The sound of her designer heels clicking forcefully across my wooden porch was like a countdown to her own downfall. Crash! The door flew inward as if she had used a battering ram instead of her foot. Wood splinters went flying. The Attorney General's coffee mug shattered on the floor, perfectly punctuating the moment. Karen burst into my living room with her phone held aloft, broadcasting everything live. Completely unaware that she had just committed criminal trespass, breaking and entering, and assault in the presence of the state's top prosecutor. "I demand to know why the Attorney General is having a secret meeting with this man," she yelled, waving her phone as if it were a weapon. "This is government harassment, political persecution. I have rights." The expression on her face when Attorney General Williamson calmly rose and presented her official credentials was utterly priceless. Karen's live stream captured the precise instant her mind grasped what had just occurred. Pure, frozen terror. "Mrs. Cromwell," the Attorney General stated in that composed, professional voice that likely made seasoned criminals tremble. "I am Patricia Williamson, Attorney General of the state. You have just committed multiple felonies in my presence, and your entire criminal act is being recorded by both my office and your own social media broadcast." Karen's phone was still live streaming. Her followers were witnessing in real time as their heroic whistleblower devolved into a stammering, incoherent wreck. The comment section erupted with confusion and disbelief as viewers realized they had been backing a criminal who had just spectacularly self-destructed on camera. This is my community. I have jurisdiction here," Karen sputtered, still under the delusion that her HOA badge granted her power over state prosecutors. That's when FBI agent Torres entered through my still-open doorway, accompanied by 2 other federal agents. "Mrs. Cromwell, you are under arrest for fraud, extortion, witness intimidation, and criminal harassment, and thanks to your live stream, We now have your confession broadcast to approximately 3,000 witnesses. The click of handcuffs closing echoed through my cabin like the final page of a book. Karen's phone fell to the floor, still streaming her arrest to an audience that had dwindled. From incensed supporters to horrified onlookers of a public breakdown. "Karen?" I said, getting up from Pop's couch with a gratified smile. "Meet the state's attorney general. She's been eager to discuss your accounting practices." The neighbors, drawn by the disturbance, stood on my porch in stunned silence as the woman who had terrorized our community for months was read her Miranda rights in my living room. Mrs. Patterson, who had driven down from her daughter's home specifically for this occasion, had tears streaming down her face. Sheriff Rodriguez showed up just in time for the walk of shame, with Karen stumbling in handcuffs past the very dock she had tried to have removed, past the solar panel she had deemed hazardous, and past the cabin she had labeled an eyesore. The pearl-white Escalade with its Rule 1 vanity plates was impounded as evidence in the fraud case. The live stream concluded with Karen's voice echoing across the lake. "This isn't finished. My husband will handle this. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Actually, Karen, we knew exactly who we were dealing with. A criminal, and criminals go to jail. Watching Karen receive her sentence 3 months later was like experiencing Christmas morning. Federal Judge Michael Harrison didn't just throw the book at her. He launched the entire legal collection. She received 3 years in federal prison, was ordered to pay $340,000 in restitution to the defrauded homeowners, and was given a lifetime prohibition from serving on any HOA board in the United States. Her husband, Robert, soon followed. The ethics inquiry found that he had been using his role as Democratic Party treasurer to leak inside information about zoning changes and development projects. He resigned in disgrace and was sentenced to 18 months for conspiracy and abuse of office. The HOA itself was disbanded more quickly than sugar in hot coffee. In its stead, we established the Clearwater Lake Volunteer Association, with a strong emphasis on volunteer, no compulsory fees, no citation power, no power-crazed presidents. Just neighbors collaborating to maintain the beauty of our little piece of heaven. My part in uncovering the corruption scheme brought me an unexpected reward. Whistleblower compensation from the recovered fraudulent funds. It turns out that when you assist the federal government in reclaiming hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars, they are quite generous with the rewards. That check for $45,000 was a tangible vindication for every sleepless night Karen had caused me, but the true triumph was seeing justice spread outward. Attorney General Williamson utilized our case as the basis for new state legislation that, unbelievably, bears my name. The Henley Act mandates that all HOAs undergo yearly independent financial audits and establishes criminal charges for harassment-based property manipulation schemes. 3 other counties used our evidence to prosecute similar fraud networks. It turned out Karen's operation was part of a much larger web of politically connected criminals who were systematically cheating homeowners in rural communities. The FBI's final report detailed over 24 related cases across 5 states. The families who had been forced out of their homes began to return as well. The Hendersons purchased a lovely new cabin 2 lots away from mine after the fraudulent value concerns on their previous property were legally nullified. Mrs. Patterson returned from Florida and hosted a block party that went on until dawn. Property values not only rebounded but skyrocketed. It seems that when you eliminate the constant danger of harassment and fake citations, people are eager to live in a peaceful lakefront community. Who would have guessed? The change extended beyond legal triumphs. Our small lake transformed into a model for sustainable community living. My off-grid cabin, once the target of Karen's eyesore citations, now offers monthly tours for those interested in solar energy and environmental responsibility. The State Environmental Agency highlighted us in their Renewable Energy Showcase. I founded the POPS Legacy Scholarship with a portion of my whistleblower compensation, offering $500 grants to young people entering trade school programs. POP always held that working with your hands was the cornerstone of an honest life, so it felt right to help the next generation embrace those same principles. The annual Clearwater Lake Festival has now become a regional highlight, raising funds for veterans' housing initiatives. Last year, we collected enough to finance 3 tiny home projects for homeless veterans. The sweet aroma of barbecue and the sound of families laughing together have replaced the toxic environment Karen had fostered. But the best part is the quiet moments. I am sitting on Pop's porch right now, watching the sunset paint the lake in hues of gold and purple. The loons are calling to one another across the water. their voices echoing off the same hills where Pop taught me to fish 60 years ago. My solar panels hum contentedly on the roof, powering a life that is finally mine again. No more certified letters, no more surprise inspections, no more designer heels clicking across my dock at sunrise. Just the gentle sound of waves against weathered wood and the certainty that sometimes, if you are stubborn and righteous enough, David can indeed defeat Goliath. The documentary team from Netflix wrapped up filming here last month. HOA Hell. How One Man Took Down a Criminal Empire is set to premiere next spring. They compensated me enough to build a guest cabin where other victims of harassment can stay while they fight their own battles, because Karen was not an anomaly. There are power-hungry HOA dictators in communities all over America, terrorizing elderly homeowners and embezzling from community funds. But now there is a guide for fighting back. Now, I'd like to hear from you. Post a comment sharing your own HOA ordeal. Believe me, you are not alone in this struggle. These stories must be shared. Click subscribe if you want more accounts of ordinary people challenging corrupt systems, because there are many more where this came from. Next week, I'll tell you about the city councilman who tried to close down a veteran's food truck until the owner's friends from the Pentagon decided to make a visit. Thanks for joining us on End for HOA, where the HOA Karens finally meet their match. If the story made you cheer or cringe, please like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit subscribe so you'll be ready for the next wild HOA story.